All right, so let's go ahead and get started. If you are in the wrong room, go ahead and stay here. But we are here to talk about Angular 2. Angular 2 is built for huge, long-lasting applications, and I hope to illustrate this to you during my talk and the live coding. So my name is Kent C. Dodds. I live in Utah. I work at a company called Alianza. We are a voice-over IP platform. I build the UI for them. I am married and have 2 kids, and I'm active in the open source community. And here are 3 other interesting things about me. I run a video broadcast podcast about Angular. It's called NG Air. Is anybody familiar with that? Yes! Yes, that's great. And then I'm an author on Egghead.io. Anybody familiar with that? Okay, I thought there'd be a few more of you. And then anybody familiar with Angular Formally? Oh, man. Yes, great. So Angular Formally is a library for form generators for Angular 1 that I wrote. And I'm working on an Angular 2 version of it, and it's going to be awesome. So those are some of the things about me. So now for me to explain to you and for you to learn Angular 2, there's something that we have to do here right from the get-go that's really, really important. So I'd like everybody to please stand up. So I know what you guys are thinking, like, oh, it's one of these. Yes, it is one of these. So it's very important. Everybody put your hands out in front of you like this. And then bend down really quick and back up. This is called an air squat. We're going to do 12 of these together. And this is really important to your learning of Angular 2, I promise. Okay, so we'll count together. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Don't you feel the Angular 2 just coming into you? 5, 6. We're halfway there. 5. No, just kidding. 7, 8, 9, 10. Don't give up on me now. 11 and 12. Thank you so much. All right. So thank you all for coming to my talk. I hope you enjoyed it. No, just kidding. Now you all know everything there is to know about Angular 2. No, thank you for that. It helps me kind of loosen up a little bit. I'll just confess I'm incredibly nervous. Whenever I give a talk, I'm always looking at a lot of people who are a lot smarter than I am and have a lot more experience than I do in many different ways. And so I appreciate us having this experience together because we've exercised together now, so we're like friends. So if you get nothing else out of my talk, at least you got some exercise. So first let me talk about what this talk is not going to be, just so that we have all of our expectations in the same place. This is not going to be a battle of the frameworks. I'm not going to talk about why Angular 2 is so much better than React or Ember or why it's so much worse. I'm not even going to do a whole lot of comparison of Angular 1 and Angular 2. I'll do a little bit, and I'll talk about other frameworks likely just for context, because many of you are familiar with these other frameworks. But for the most part, that's not what this talk is about. It's also not exactly what Angular 2 is going to look like when it's actually released. We are using the bleeding edge here at Philly ETE. And one thing we forget is when we're using the bleeding edge, it's us who is bleeding. So. And Angular 2 is right now is certainly no exception to this. It's extremely alpha, and so I will show you the parts that are finished and talk about some of the parts that are not and some of the parts that will likely change. But at the same time, this talk isn't going to be totally worthless. Hopefully, you are going to see some of the concepts and ideas about Angular 2 that will enable huge and long-lasting applications. It's not going to be a demo of a huge, long-lasting application because Angular 2 is not ready for that. But the concepts and principles that it introduces enables that, and you'll see why. And then it's also, this talk is not given by an Angular 2 expert. I know Angular 1 very well, and preparing a talk for Angular 1 is pretty easy for me. Preparing a talk for Angular 2 has been kind of a nightmare because it's just, it just is a little bit. So I'm not an Angular expert. So what this talk is, we're going to do a live coding demo example of an Angular 2 app. Very small app, but it should show you the different ideas and concepts of Angular 2. And pray to the demo gods for me that this works. And I will demonstrate features like components, templates, and services, and many other features in Angular 2. And this talk is given by an Angular 2 beginner, just reiterating that fact. So this is the app that we're going to be building. It's a random user app. So you come to the app, you see this nice little card, and it says, please click on Get New User. We click that, we get a spinner, and we get user data. This is being powered by randomuser.me. If you're not familiar with that, it's super awesome for handy little demos like this. So this is what we're going to be building. I'll keep this up so that we can compare. And this is the app that we have. It's running localhost, so you can tell the difference. This is actually live. You can go to this right now. So this is our shell for this application. So far right now, our app has no Angular 2 components in it whatsoever. And so we'll be building it sort of from scratch. So let's go ahead and code. And I also, people are always like, you must be insane for live coding. I really like live coding. I think that you all are very smart and you get code. And so hopefully this is something that we can kind of share together and enjoy and is useful for everybody. So if we refresh this page, we'll get hello Phil ETE as an alert. So we do have some JavaScript running in our page, but again, this isn't Angular 2 at all. I'm going to turn on live reload because I don't want to have to refresh all the time. So there's that. So every application or every web page starts with an index.html. So if we look at that, I'm not going to show you too much of this. The only thing that really matters is this right here. The main tag doesn't matter. This can be called whatever. I could even make it a div if I was crazy. But it's just this is the beginning of our application. We're going to use this for the bootstrap of our Angular app. Everything else, just shield your eyes. Oh, whoops, I forgot to take out the vanity of Google Analytics. Just shield your eyes from the rest of this. This is not what Angular 2 is going to require you to do. It's just some weird things that you have to do because you're bleeding right now. So let's go ahead and build our first Angular component. So we're going to build this main component. So in Angular 2, there are a couple of concepts that I should first start out with. Angular 2 uses ES6. It's built with TypeScript, or soon to be. Lots of people are concerned that because it's built with TypeScript, that you are going to be required to use ES6 and have a build step. And that is absolutely not true. And the Angular team has asked me to reiterate this to you. You do not have to use ES6 or anything, any sort of build of any kind to use Angular 2. It all compiles down to ES5. And you can use ES5 and just script tags in your page if you want to. And if I'm so sorry if you do that, because life is so much better with a build step to be able to use these latest and greatest technologies. And these latest technologies is what enables some of the huge and long-lasting parts of these applications that we'll be talking about. So if you're not familiar with ES6, get familiar. It's the future. Also, in addition to ES6, Angular has this concept called annotations, which is a subset of a concept called decorators, which has been proposed by Yehuda Katz to the TC39, and they're working on standardizing that. So that's the one concept in Angular that is not part of the ES6 standard. And there's a regular ES5 way to accomplish those as well. So if you didn't understand anything that I said, don't worry. This is why I don't like to just do slides. This is why I like to show you code, because it makes a lot more sense when you just see the characters on in the text document. So let's take out the alert. And the first thing that we're going to do is we'll make a class called main. So every component is a class. And then we want to tell Angular that this main class is what we want to bootstrap onto our page. So we'll say bootstrap main. But this bootstrap doesn't just come magically from any global scope, because globals are sad and bad. We're going to actually import this using ES6 imports. So we'll import bootstrap from Angular 2. And we'll get rid of this thing because this is useless. And so now we're actually bootstrapping a class. And if we save this and we go back to our app, let's pull up the dev tools so we can see some errors here. So the first error that we're going to see is there's no directive annotation found on main. That's useful. And so let's go up into, or let me talk about quickly what that means. So in Angular 1, there's this concept of directives that's like, you could think of those as components. There are a lot of different types of directives, and the directive definition object, when you define a directive, is probably the reason that there are so many searches for the term Angular in Google, because it's so complex. But in Angular 2, they've simplified this greatly by instead having specific types of directives that serve a specific purpose. And one of these types of directives is a component. And so we're going to import component from Angular 2, and this component is an annotation. So to do or to use an annotation, you say @component, and then you provide it the configuration for this component. So the one thing that we need to specify for our component is the selector. So what elements does this component apply to? And if we look at our index.html, we see it applies to main. So we specify the CSS selector for the elements that this should apply to. So I'll say selector is main. And let's go ahead and save and see what we broke. Now we have a no template found for main. So now we need to specify what does the template look like for this component. So we'll bring in another annotation called template, and @template, and this will be inline. And we'll use backticks. ES6 is awesome. Multi-length strings for the win. And we'll do a div, hello, Philly, ETE. And now we have an Angular application. Woo! Why am I the only one clapping? That's so exciting. So this is all that you need for a basic Angular 2 component. And as I said, these annotations, like you may look at them and be like, oh man, Java and JavaScript's like, why? And if you're thinking that, then I don't know what to say. But if you don't like this, then you can just simply do main.annotations is an array and say new component and provide your configuration there. So it's very easy to work around this, but this is the way that the community is moving. And I kind of looked in disgust at this at first, and I've grown fond of it now. And so I recommend that you just give this a little bit of time if you're not comfortable with this, and you will love it too. So, okay, so this is a very, very interesting app, am I right? Like, hello, Philly ETE, we're all done. No, we're not. We want to start building out our actual application. So let's look at our example of what we're actually trying to accomplish. So if we look at this, we can see we have got a button. So that's something that we definitely are going to want to build. And we have this card. And this, to me, says component. So I can look at this, and all that this thing needs is some sort of user object to display data. And so I'm going to create a component for this card, and then we'll pass in a user for the display. So let's go ahead and create that card right now. I'm going to make a new file called usercard.js. And in here, we'll just copy and paste lots of this stuff, and we'll see what we need to change from the normal bootstrapped component to a regular component you'll use in your application. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is we are not going to be bootstrapping this component. You only bootstrap a single component in your application, and then everything is kind of attached to that component in some way. So we don't need to import bootstrap anymore. Then the next thing is we don't want this to apply to the main tag. Let's have this apply to the user card tag. And now, because we're not bootstrapping this, we need to find a way to get a hold of this this component. And so we're going to use ES6 export, and we'll rename this to random user. So now we have our random user card, user card. Random user is for something else. I was up late last night. So yeah, and let's just quickly change the template because I'm just so excited about Philly ETE. and we also want to make sure that this works. So there we go. That's basic template. We have everything in here that we want to. And so let's go back to our main and use this template. So in Angular 1, what you generally do is you just say user card, and you would expect this to work. But in Angular 2, there's an entirely new concept. So with Angular 1, you had this global injector, and this was cool and also not so cool in certain ways. So you say, hey, Angular, I've got this directive. You register it with the injector, and then anybody else who's using that same injector, which is everybody else in the app, has access to your directive. This is really cool because they don't have to really think about what they have access to, but it's at the same time, it's not so cool because you don't know when it's safe to remove code. You don't know what your dependencies are, so it makes testability a little bit difficult. And you have to sort of enforce modularity yourself. So Angular 2 has taken a little bit of a different route and has gone to a concept that more follows explicit dependencies. So instead of just saying, like, everything goes everywhere, each component has you could think of it as its own injector, and so you have to be explicit about the dependencies for that injector. This is awesome. So for this to actually work, let's just go prove that this doesn't work. There's nothing there, and if we look at the DOM, it just shows our user card, so that hasn't actually compiled. So for this to work, inside of our template, we need to tell Angular for this template what directives it's going to be using. So we specify that with directives property, and that's an array of the directives that we're going to use. So let's import the directive, or the component in our case. This is a user card from user card. And then we'll tell Angular, hey, this template uses the user card directive. And so it will take this array, and it will use those directives and their selectors to determine what needs to be compiled inside of the template. Hopefully this is all making sense. If it's not, like, just shout, like, this doesn't make any sense. And I'll be like, I'm so sorry. So now everything is working. The user card directive has been compiled and loaded into our template. So this is great. Now we're able to use components where you have explicit dependencies. And so, yeah, that's exciting. OK, but it's not super exciting because we still don't have this. Angular's not going to just write my app for me. Like, this is outrageous. So let's go ahead and build this out. And because I know that nobody likes watching other people just write HTML, does anybody like people writing HTML? Yeah, OK. I've got this handy little clipboard that I'm going to just steal all of my, or lots of my mundane stuff from. So we'll just paste that in there. And I'll just show you really quick. I'm not showing you anything about CSS, like CSS is CSS. But I do have classes for my CSS to work, so that's what all these classes are all about. And then we have an image tag here with a source of Fred, and all of this stuff is just hard-coded data. So there's no binding going on here at all. Now let's look at what our app looks like now. So now, who recognizes this man? Those of you who are not raising your hands, just go look up I Love Lucy and watch it. I've watched this series twice. We own the whole season, or the whole thing, and it's awesome. So I Love Lucy. OK, so yeah, that's exciting. You've shown me HTML. Cool. Like, there's really, so far, nothing all that mind-blowing about Angular 2. And I'm afraid to say that here in a moment I'm going to show you something else that is also not all that mind-blowing, but it's an important, it demonstrates a couple of important points. So with Angular 2, everything is a controller. So this user card component, that's actually a controller. And so if we want to bind data to in our template, then we need to put that data in our controller. And then our template will get that data from the controller. So let's go ahead and add a constructor to our class. And we'll create a user. So this .user equals the data for Fred. So let's go back to our clipboard because nobody likes watching typing data either. And we'll just paste that in here. So we have a name, first and last, username, email, picture. And now let's go through and instead of having all of this hard-coded data, we'll change this to bound data. So we'll say user.name.first. So there we've got that data there. And user.name.last. So let's just make sure nothing's broken. We have Fred Mertz. If I change the data to Freddie Mertz, then now it updates to Freddie. So we see that this binding is actually happening. This is like nobody should be surprised. Ember also uses the same type of syntax with the curly braces, and this is Angular's syntax for binding. That is here to stay, and it works well. So let's. I'll quickly go through these user.username, and we'll do user.email. Okay. So everything is still working. So far, so good. The one thing that we don't have that's not dynamic in our template right now is Fred's picture. So now we get into something that's a little bit interesting with our template syntax. So in Angular 1, what you would do is you'd say ng source, and then you'd say user.picture.medium. And yeah, so that's how you would specify this. And raise your hand if you know why you have to do ng source instead of just source. Yeah, not very many hands up. That's a problem. And so it requires some domain knowledge to even know how to use some of these directives. And that's the real problem that the new template syntax solves is you shouldn't have to go look at the documentation or look at the implementation rather even to know how to use these directives. So Angular has just kind of thrown that away and gone to more of a DOM property approach. And so instead of this ng source, you actually can just say bind source. And this bind dash applies to any property of an element. So we can say like bind style. And we can, so any property that you can put on a DOM element, you can have a bind dash for it. And this is actually, and no longer do you need to have these curly braces because when you specify bind, it's expecting to have something that's on your controller or on your instance of the component. And so this is really powerful because now you as the user of this component or of this element are being explicit about how you want your properties to be evaluated for that component. And that's a very awesome thing. So, and then if you don't have the bind, Angular just interprets this. Well, it doesn't interpret it at all. It's just saying this source is assigned to a string of this user.picture.medium, which is like the actual way that HTML works. But having the bind dash will say this is actually bound to the property at source on the image element. So hopefully that makes sense. You may like this syntax, but I actually prefer a smaller or a shorthand syntax, and that is the brackets. And so these are equivalent. You can use brackets instead, and this basically just comes from the concept in JavaScript where I can say this.user name, and that's the accessor for the name property. So that's where the brackets come from. That doesn't really matter all that much, but it sort of helps you map like what this is actually attempting to do. You're just binding to that property. So yeah, hope that makes sense. I'm seeing some nods, so that's good. Keep nodding or shaking your heads. It's good cues for me to keep talking about something or just stop talking. So let's make sure that this actually works. So yeah, we're still getting Fred in there, and so everything is good. Okay, so this is a really awesome component, and I can distribute it to my team and be like, hey, check this out. You can have Fred on your page. Isn't that great? And they're like, no, that's not great because I want Ethel on my page. And so you're like, okay, fine. I'm going to make this a little bit more extensible. So let's do that. We're going to take this user, or we'll take the entire constructor, actually, from our user card, and we'll move it over to our main. And so now our main has the user, and we want to pass the user into our user card. So in Angular 1, what you would do is you'd say user equals user, and then on your directive, you would specify, hey, I'm looking for a user attribute, and that's bound with the equal sign. It's like, what is that? But now, because we're binding to properties, we can say, I want to bind to the property of user, And also, again, you can do bind dash. And I'm going to provide you the user object that's on my instance of the component. So let's go back to the user card and say, hey, Angular, I'm expecting, or I have a user property that people can bind to. And that happens in our component. So here we'll say bind. And this will be an object where the key is the name of the property that I want to be assigned on my internal component instance. And the value is a string being the name of the attribute that people can use to bind to that property. So for us, for simplicity, we'll just say user is user. So you no longer have this crazy weird, like, what the heck is that? You just do user, and it just makes a lot of sense. One other really cool feature about this that isn't ready, but you can actually, if you know what this is from Angular 1, this is called a filter in Angular 1. It's called a pipe in Angular 2. And you can actually pipe the properties that are being sent into you through filters or pipes. Yeah, terms. That's a really cool feature. Pipes don't actually exist in Angular 2 yet, so that is forthcoming. OK, so now we're binding to the user property of our controller based on the user attribute on the user card. So if I save this, everything should still be working. And indeed it is. So yay. Now we can actually reuse this component and specify our own user as long as that user follows these specific properties. So let's go back to our main. Now let's make this a little bit more dynamic and change the user and see what happens. So we're going to use set timeout and arrow functions for the win. And after 1 second, we're going to change this.user to a new object from our clipboard, Ethel's data. OK, so if we go back here, we see Fred, and then we see Ethel. Yeah, who here knows, yeah, first off, who here knows why arrow functions make this so awesome? So in regular JavaScript land, this is kind of a tangent, but I think it's cool. So in regular JavaScript land, you would just do function and then this.user. But in this case, this is bound to window. Yeah, I love JavaScript. And so to accomplish this, you'd say bind this so that this function has the right context it's executing in. With arrow functions, you have a lexical this, and so that's implied. So anyway, use arrow functions. They're great. Just don't use arrow functions with arguments, because that will hurt you. So life's good. Another interesting thing about this, and this actually does matter with Angular 2, is in Angular 1, to do a timeout, you would generally use the timeout service. And all that timeout, a $timeout would do is it would run your timeout, and then it would invoke scope.apply. And how many people know what scope.apply means or does? OK, so basically, scope.apply tells Angular, hey, I changed something. You don't know about it. I'm telling you about it right now. And this many times, you were just using Angular things to do stuff, and they would do this scope.apply for you. But if you're using a third-party library that knows nothing about Angular, they're not going to be doing that for you. So you have to do it yourself, and it's a pain in the rear. So we no longer have to worry about this because of something that they've developed called zone.js, which comes from Dart, and other languages have this concept. But it basically, zone.js enables Angular to know when asynchronous tasks have completed, and it will run its dirty checking or its change detection when that occurs. And so we no longer have to worry about informing Angular that things have changed, which is really, really nice. So we just have set timeout here. Everything's working as we would expect. But oh, and one other thing I wanted to mention about the change detection, it is like insanely faster than Angular 1. So if you ever built a big enough application to bump into the performance issues with Angular 1, I have good news for you. You can build a bigger and faster application now with Angular 2 because the change detection is crazy, crazy faster. So like 3 to 10 times faster. OK, so let's make this a little bit more interesting. We're iterating on this app. So we're going to add a button that will change from Fred to Ethel. So let's go ahead and we'll extract this logic from the set timeout into a function that will set this user object for us. So we'll say get new user is our function, and we'll just simply assign Ethel to that user object. And now we're going to bring in our button. Let me go back to my clipboard because reasons. And oops, just this stuff. We'll go back to our main and fix that. So now we have our button. It's just got a couple classes and some other interesting things. It also has autofocus, so I don't have to click on it. And if I hit spacebar, nothing happens. Enter, like click, and we haven't set up any sort of click handling or anything like that. So that's why this actually isn't doing anything interesting yet. And so in Angular 1, the way you would accomplish this is you'd say ng-click equals get new user. You'd invoke that. And so there's nothing about the ng-click directive that says, hey, I expect a statement that I will run on some sort of event. There's nothing in Angular or in that ng-click directive. When I look at it, I can't just simply see, oh, that's a statement directive. And that's a real problem with from a scalability, large team application. Like everybody in the Angular world knows that ng-click, oh, you give it a statement, but you don't know that just by looking at it. And then when you want to create your own ng-click or your own thing that requires a statement, there's no way that you can express to the user, hey, I expect a statement. And so again, this is another thing that has been changed to on. And so this isn't just another directive. This is a part of the template syntax. So Angular will take anything that is prefixed with on dash and take the suffix and say, okay, that's an event that I'm going to listen for. So they'll add an event listener for that event and run your statement whenever that event fires. What is really cool about this is insanely enabling because now you don't need to write a directive for every single event that you want to fire. And with web components, you can fire your own events. Well, really with anything, you can fire your own events, but specifically this is important for web components. And so if I had a web component that was like on Philly rocks, which will be always, then I can do this and I don't have to write an entire directive to handle this. So this is very enabling. So we can say onClick get new user. If I save that, I get the new user and Ethel emerges from behind Fred. So there is shorthand syntax that I prefer. You can just use this parentheses. And rest assured, all of the shorthand syntax, this is valid HTML. It may not pass validators that didn't expect non-alphanumeric characters, but in the HTML spec, you can go look it up. This is valid HTML. Pretty much everything is valid HTML except like that. That would not be valid. So yeah, so there you go. I prefer the shorter syntax. And this kind of comes from the idea, like in your JavaScript, you say this.user invoke. So you have that parentheses. So that kind of maps nicely between the template and your JavaScript. So yeah, so far, so good. We can get a new user. Yeah, and Ethel emerges from Fred. All right. I hope I'm not going way too fast. Okay, I'm seeing no's. That's great. Okay, so the next thing that we want to accomplish is, as much as I love Fred, and I really do, I don't want to see him every single time. And I want to actually get random users when I hit this get new user. So let's enable that really quick. So in Angular 1, you would want to keep your business logic out of your controllers. Business logic and view logic should be separate. That's just a good design principle regardless of the framework you're using. And so this hasn't changed with Angular 2. You still want to take away your business logic outside of your view logic. And so we're going to create a service that will go and get the random user for us. And then our main component will use this service to get a new user. So let's go ahead and make that service. We'll call this service randomuser.js. And to create a service in Angular 2, It's just JavaScript. So this is a really nice thing for, or a little bit of a divergence. You can accomplish this in Angular 1, but it's not common to do so. But in Angular 2, it's very much just JavaScript. So you can say export class random user, and in here we can define our methods. So we'll say get user, and then we can go off and do our user fetching. So right here, this is a totally valid Angular 2 service. There's no Angular code in here at all, and I think that's really powerful. Huge fan of that. So let's actually go ahead and put in the code for getting a random user. So we'll use const because we rock. And we'll say URL is http://api.randomuser.me. So that's the API we're using. Love randomuser.me, they're awesome. And then we're going to return a promise. And so we'll return. And here, in Angular 1, you'd say $HTTP. Maybe in the future, in Angular 2, you will also say $HTTP. But right now, they don't have an HTTP service yet. So they're building that. So my buddy Matt Zabriskie out in Utah built a vanilla JS version of $HTTP, which is totally rad. So it's called Axios, and I encourage you to go look at it. And if you're doing React, he built it for React, and it works great with React. So it also works great for Angular. OK, so we're going to say axios.get URL. And then we're going to do some pretty crazy things because the API, and we're hiding this logic from our controller, which is nice. So then we'll take the response and say return response.data.results firstResult.user. Just ignore that. That's just random user API stuff. But the idea is when we get this user, the promise is resolved with the user. So let's go back to our main. And let's use this random user service. So in Angular 1, you would just say random user. But Angular has no idea what random user is. We haven't told it anything about this random user. And this is all kind of going back to the same concept of explicit dependencies. So you tell Angular, for this component, I depend on this thing. And yeah, that's huge. So let's go ahead and tell Angular, for this component, I depend on this thing. So we'll say services. Oops, not an object, but an array of services that this component depends on. So it'll be random user. And then this random user isn't just like magically on the page. We need to import it from random user. And now we have access to this service. So to get an instance of this class, of this random user service, we inject it into our constructor. To do this, you can say like R. It doesn't matter what the argument name is. What matters is the type. And so we're saying the type for this this parameter or this argument is a random user type. And again, reiterating, you do not have to do this if you don't want to introduce types into your application. I don't know why you wouldn't want to do that if you want to build something for real and really big with a big team. But you don't have to do this. There is a workaround. But for the sake of time, I'm not going to show you what that is. You can look that up yourselves. Homework. Thought you were read of that, right? No, just kidding. So we'll say a random user. So this is an instance of the random user class. So Angular will instantiate this instance of the class for us and then hand us our instance. So then inside of our constructor, we're going to say this.get random user is equal to the random user get user function. And so now I can use this.get random user inside of my get new user function. So I'll say get random user dot or invoke that, and then take the user and assign it to this.user. Arrow functions for the win. Some of you guys might be like, oh, yuck, one-liners. I love it. So, OK, so I'm fairly confident everything should work. Let's see. I coded quite a bit, so we'll see if something breaks. So I click the button, and we get a new user. Yes! Woo! Yeah! Thank you. So yeah, we can click this button all day long. We keep getting new users, and there's a little bit of latency because internet things. So we want our application to be asynchronous, and so we're going to add a spinner. And this is taking longer than I was expecting. I'm done at like 11:15, right? Oh, man. I'm sorry if you felt like I've been going fast, because I'm going to go a little bit faster. So now what we need to do is, we're done with our random user. We don't need to deal with this anymore. And I promise, I practiced this like 3 times, and it never took this long. I don't know what's wrong. So yeah, we're going to now create a loading spinner for while we're loading this random user. So we need to store some state in our component to say, hey, it is currently loading, and now it's finished loading. So that state will reside in the component that's responsible for getting the user. So we'll say this.loading equals true. And then we're going to have to get rid of our awesome one-liner function. Too bad. Well, I didn't have to, I guess. I could, never mind. So we'll say loading is false. And then we'll still assign this user. And then just because we're responsible developers, we'll say for the failing case, it's still loading is false. OK, so now let's use this loading. So if we look at our app, when it's loading, that loading indicator appears inside of our component, and just because that looks prettier. So we're going to pass this loading state into our user card so it can show us that loading spinner. So we'll say loading is equal to our loading property on our controller. And then we'll go into our user card, and we'll tell Angular we expect a loading property assigned to my component, and it will be from the loading attribute. And then we have to do a couple of things to our template. So the first thing that we're going to do is we'll create a div, and we're going to, you may not have known this, but for every DOM node in the browser, it has a hidden property that when set to true, will hide that DOM node. Fancy that. So we don't have to create an entire directive called ng-hide to accomplish this. We are going to use the hidden property and bind that to the loading state. So because this is the loading spinner, we want this to be hidden when it's not loading. And then for the opposite case, when we do want to show the user, we'll say hidden when loading. And then we'll wrap all of our user-specific stuff inside of this hidden loading. Oh, hiding, thank you. Boy, that would have been embarrassing. OK, and we'll backspace that. And then we'll put our loading thing here. And just for now, we'll just say loading with a lot of exclamation points because we're really excited. So it's loading, and it's loading, and it's loading. Okay, so that's really nice. We didn't have to create some sort of weird new directive to make that happen. We're just binding to the property of the DOM node. So that's very important to realize is Angular, with their new template syntax, has made many fewer rules and fewer exceptions to those rules, which makes things a lot more powerful. So I want to demonstrate one other concept to you. I don't think I'm going to finish all of my live code, which is so sad. Look at the code later. But I want to demonstrate to you that Angular 2 works really nicely with web components. So if you're not familiar with web components, this may not be so awesome to you as it is to me. But it is awesome, so just trust me. So we're going to say content select is loading. And this will be an attribute of loading. So basically what this is saying in the web component spec is take the content or like whatever is inside this user card and slap it into here, but only slap the stuff that matches this selector. This will make sense when I actually show you how this works. So I'll go inside my user card, and I'm going to add some content to that element. And I'm going to add a div that has a loading attribute, so that matches that selector I specified. And in here, forget this, I'm going to clipboard that. Oh, forget this, I forgot to clipboard that. And so we'll just make it our loading spinner here. So class FA, don't worry about this. This is just CSS stuff. Refresh, FA 2x, FA spin. OK, so that's our loading spinner. And if we go back, we hit get new user, we have our loading spinner. Yay! And so what's really cool and what I want to illustrate about this is in Angular 1, you had to do some funny transclusion stuff. And if you wanted to have multiple insertion points into your template, good luck. It's not a lot of fun. And so with the power of web components, and Angular is shimming these for you, or polyfilling web components for you in older browsers. So you just need to think about things as web components. You can very easily utilize web components inside of your application. And this is just one feature of the Shadow DOM web components. But yeah, Angular 2 plays very nicely with web components, which is the future of the web and HTML. So yeah, I was going to show you quite a bit more, but I think I do want to leave a little bit of time for questions. Even though when I was preparing this talk, I was like, I think I'm just going to take all the time, then nobody can ask me any questions. But I feel brave, and we'll go ahead and I'll open it up for questions here in just a moment. So let's go back to our slides, and I just want to show a few last things. So the title of this talk, again, is Angular 2 built for huge, long-lasting applications. So you may have watched this live code demo and thought, like, I don't see anything about how this could make it huge or long-lasting. That was a very small app, very simple. The first thing about long-lasting is it's using the future technologies, ES6. And so your application will stand the test of at least ES6 with classes and all of the other really cool things that come in ES6. It also is utilizing web components, which is the future of the web. And that just enables your application to live even longer. There also are types, and types is another thing that Angular team and TypeScript team are trying to work through the TC39 process to get them standardized, and there is some interest there. But types makes your application long-lasting because when you write your component 2 years down the line, if you've had types in there, nobody has to actually look at your implementation to know how to use it because the tooling will tell them, oh, this component requires these things, and they are to be of this type. So that is a huge maintainability win. And also testability. So Angular 1, one of the things that we loved about Angular 1 was how testable it was, with the dependency injection in particular. We haven't lost this with Angular 2, and it's actually gotten even better with the explicit dependencies. So those are a few of the reasons why Angular 2 is long-lasting, or will help you build long-lasting applications. For the huge part of things, because Angular 2 is using ES6 and enables you to do this, they've thrown away their modules solution. It was great for its time, and it's not great anymore because we have ES6 modules. This enables modularity, and so the cool thing about modularity is you can think about your huge application as just a simple, small feature at a time. And so you keep all of your features together and have a team that just works on this little piece. And because it's modular, you know that the changes that they make in this weird isolated spot aren't going to affect some other crazy place in the application. And it also enables code splitting. So one of the big problems with client-side applications is the bigger it gets, the longer it takes for the user to load when they come to your application for the first time or when you update your app. And so by doing things modularly, you can use tools like Webpack to split your code into these different chunks. So you could split them into the different chunks for features and then lazy load those things when the user comes to the admin page, for example. And so when this user just logs in, they don't need to get the whole thing. They just get the login page, and then they move on and they get the next thing that they're going to. Explicit dependencies, I can't stress enough how awesome this is and how much of a big win this is from a modularity standpoint and a design principle standpoint. So knowing what your dependencies are is a very important thing, I think. Change detection, again, is insanely faster, and so you'll have to be doing some pretty crazy things to make Angular slow, Angular 2 slow. And that combined with immutability makes things even better because the change detection can take advantage of this immutability and know whether it needs to dirty check an entire model, or if that model instance has changed, then it knows, okay, now I do need to check this. If that instance hasn't changed, then because it's immutable, it can just rely on the fact that if the instance didn't change, none of its properties did either, which is insanely powerful. So if performance is a big deal for you, look at immutability. Here's a long list of resources. I'm pretty sure this is comprehensive. No, just kidding. But there are a lot of resources on these slides. So feel free to look at my slides. I've got a link here at the end. Lots of videos and different other useful links. And that's my talk. So thank you very much for listening. Yes. So I do think I have about 10 minutes for questions. Am I right? I think so. Throw them at me. I'm nervous, but...
Yeah, so this is both awesome and scary at the same time. I have to say, from what little experience I have with Angular 1, I was really blown away by that, and this looks even better. I was wondering if they made the loading of data like something like ng-init. Is that still the same, or is that also completely different? Because I saw that there's no such thing as scope anymore, at least not in any of the code that you showed. So where would that live exactly?
Yeah, so that would all happen in your constructor. So anything that you need to initialize for your component, that would happen in your constructor. And your question actually, it's scary and exciting at the same time, reminded me of something else I wanted to cover, which is the migration strategy. So when Angular 2 was first announced and talked about at NG Europe, the community just exploded. They were freaking out because it's so wildly different. Everything's dying, like scope is dying and everything. So just in response to that question before I get it, is Angular 2 is still in like heavy development. It has a long way to go before it actually is totally ready. And between now and whenever it's ready, we still have several Angular 1 versions that they're working on. We'll likely get to 1.6 or 1.7 before we even have a 2.0. And so between now and then, the Angular team is very motivated on making the migration path as simple as possible. So there are, and also like Google is motivated to pressure them to make the migration path easy because they have 2,000 apps written in Angular at Google. And so it's important to Google to say, hey, Angular team, get your act together. We want this to be easy. And the Angular team cares about us as well. And so they're going to work hard to make this easy as well. And the one migration path that they have already kind of disclosed that I think is brilliant is they have a new router that will work for Angular 2 and Angular 1. So you can use it in your Angular 1 applications now. And when it comes time to migrate, you can tell the router, this route is an Angular 2 app, and this route is an Angular 1 part of my app. And so you can slowly migrate these different pieces. And that, in addition to whatever they're going to do to ease the migration process, I think the migration won't be free because the templates are obviously wildly different. But it will be much easier. So good question. Thanks for reminding me of that other. Did I answer your original question? Yeah. OK, great. Thank you.
I have a couple of questions, actually.
Just throw them at me.
So we started developing applications in Angular last year, and it was cool, and it is still cool. But now, like, we have two major applications in production, and it's basically desktop applications. But what we see is like we use a lot of directives and templates, and we see that a lot of performance problems around it. And now that we are seeing, we're trying to make those applications mobile, like responsive. And now we see a lot of performance problems, especially in the mobile phones. So how do we make sure that in Angular 2 that does not happen? And other question is around one-way and two-way binding, because we basically see two-way binding is being applicable everywhere, and we don't have one-way binding yet. And we see a lot of performance issues there. Right. So how do we make sure that Angular 2 will not have that problem?
Right, good question. So I think Angular 2 solves this problem performance in a really great way with their new change detection. And that's only made possible by the new way that Angular 2 works in comparison to Angular 1. And so because the change detection, well, I don't have time to cover it, but if you look at my slides here, I have a link to change detection talk that was given at NGConf just 2 months ago that describes how change detection works. But just trust me, it is insanely faster. And if performance is really important to you, which I think to most of us it's very important, especially in huge apps, then look into immutability in your data models, and that will help with the performance issues that you have. Yeah, that's about. Did you have another question that you wanted to ask?
And my other question is like we've been using like JavaScript frameworks for the last, I would say, I've been using for 6 years. And my question is, within 6 months, there are like 3 frameworks. It's very difficult for us to understand, like, why do we shift from Angular 1 to 2, or from jQuery to Angular? So,
yeah, good question. Welcome to JavaScript. So that's more of a general question that is an interesting conversation point. So Angular 1 is a fantastic framework, and you can make it work really, really well. And React is also a fantastic Vue library. Ember is also a fantastic library or framework. And so it's a difficult decision to make, but I would just say study it out a little bit, ask some people who have experience with both, and then make your decision and stick with it. I really, as much as I love Angular, I would have no problems with anybody deciding that they want to do React or they want to do Ember. It's just really whatever they want to do. And so that doesn't really answer your question, because I don't think that there is a good answer to that question. That's just the nature of the beast right now with JavaScript, whereas languages that have been around for a while have kind of gotten over this, and they kind of figured out, like, this is what works. JavaScript, not only is the language evolving like crazy fast, but we're still trying to figure out what works well for front-end technologies. So that's just the nature of things. I personally love it, and I think it's really fun, but it's really frustrating for the business. So that's just the nature of JavaScript. I hope that was satisfactory. Do we have any other questions? All right, I think we'll close it up. Thank you, and catch me around the conference and on Twitter.